The rain fell in a fine mist over Haversley Manor, a veil of silver that blurred the contours of the imposing stone edifice against the autumn sky. The carriage wheels had left deep impressions in the muddy lane, the only evidence of life in a place that seemed to have forgotten the very meaning of existence. Clara Wynn clutched the letter more tightly as she approached the imposing iron gates. The parchment, once crisp and bearing a crimson seal, was now soft at the edges where the rain had caught it. She had found it that morning, half buried in the mud near the village square, its seal already broken, its secrets already spilled. The elegant feminine script inside bore the name Haldenmere, the Duke's name, and propriety demanded she return it, though the hour grew late and the weather most inclement. A matter of conscience, she had explained to her father, the parish vicar, who had frowned at her determination, but could not argue against the moral imperative that drove her. The gates of Haversley stood open, an unusual occurrence that the villagers had remarked upon with hushed whispers. "The Duke has not closed them since the funeral," Mrs. Pembroke had said in the tea-room, her voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper, as if he waits eternally for her return. Clara's modest boots sank into the gravel of the drive as she made her way toward the great house. No gardeners tended the once immaculate topiary. Nature had begun to reclaim what man had abandoned. The windows stared back at her, dark and shuttered, save for a single light that flickered in what she presumed to be the library. When at last she reached the imposing oak door, she hesitated. The brass knocker, a lion's head with a ring clasped in its jaws, seemed to stare at her in silent judgment. 3 times she lifted her hand, and 3 times she faltered, until at last courage prevailed, and she struck the metal against wood, the sound echoing through what she imagined to be empty corridors within. The wait that followed stretched beyond the boundaries of propriety or comfort. Clara had nearly convinced herself to leave the letter on the step when she heard the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps. Heavy, measured, deliberate, they spoke of a man who moved through life with precision rather than passion. The door opened without creak or groan, revealing a tall figure silhouetted against the dim light of the entrance hall. The Duke of Haldenmere stood before her, his frame imposing despite the slight stoop of his shoulders. His attire was impeccable, a frock coat of the deepest black, waistcoat similarly somber, and a cravat of dark silk secured with a pin of jet. The uniform of grief, worn with the same rigid discipline with which a soldier might wear his regimentals. "Yes?" The single syllable contained neither welcome nor rebuke, merely a question that required answering. Clara cursed, a gesture made awkward by the rain that had dampened her skirts. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. I am Miss Clara Wynn, the vicar's daughter. I found this letter in the village square." She extended her hand, the letter nestled in her palm like an offering. "I believe it belongs to you." The Duke's gaze fell upon the parchment, and for a moment, something flickered across his features, a shadow, a memory, a pain too raw to be called grief, and too enduring to be called shock. He made no move to take it. "It bears your name, Your Grace," Clara continued, her voice faltering under the weight of his silent scrutiny. "I thought it proper to return it directly." "And what of its contents, Miss Wynn?" His voice was low, controlled, with the faintest hint of an accent that spoke of education at the finest institutions. Did propriety extend to an examination of the letter's secrets? Color bloomed in Clara's cheeks, indignation momentarily overcoming her trepidation. "Sir, I assure you I did not read beyond what was necessary to ascertain its rightful owner. The seal was already broken when I discovered it." For a long moment, he regarded her with eyes that seemed to have forgotten how to see the living. Then, with a movement so sudden it startled her, he reached out and took the letter from her hand. His fingers, she noted, were bare of rings, save for the heavy signet that marked his station. "You have done your duty, Miss Wynn." He stepped back, clearly intending to close the door. "I shall not detain you further in this inclement weather." "Your Grace," Clara began, though she knew not what she intended to say. Perhaps it was the hollowness she sensed behind his formal address, or the way the shadows seemed to cling to him even in the light. But before she could continue, a voice called from within the house. "Uncle, who calls at this hour?" The Duke turned, revealing behind him a small figure in white, a child of no more than 8 years, with hair the color of wheat and eyes that seemed too large for her delicate face. "Return to your chambers, Lydia," the Duke commanded, though not unkindly. "It is merely someone returning a lost correspondence." The girl's gaze settled on Clara, curiosity briefly illuminating features that seemed etched in the same sorrow that haunted her guardian. Then, with a silent nod, she disappeared back into the shadows of the house. The Duke turned back to Clara. and for an instant she glimpsed something beyond the careful mask of indifference, a vulnerability as raw as an open wound. "The hour grows late, Miss Wynn," he said, his voice softer now. "I thank you for your conscientiousness." As the door began to close, Clara caught a glimpse of the entrance hall beyond. Upon a side table rested a vase of white roses, their petals beginning to brown at the edges. Beside them, a portrait draped in black crepe, a woman's face just visible beneath the somber fabric, her smile frozen in time. The door closed with a finality that seemed to echo through the gathering dusk. Clara stood for a moment, rain mingling with unbidden tears on her cheeks, though she could not have explained why she wept. Behind her, a church bell tolled the hour. 7 chimes that seemed to whisper, "Return, return, return." A flash of movement caught her eye, a face at an upper window, the child Lydia, watching her retreat with silent solemnity. Clara raised her hand in a tentative farewell. The curtain fell, and the window was once again as empty as the rest of Haversley Manor. The letter had been delivered. Her duty was complete. Yet as Clara turned to make her way back down the long drive, she felt with inexplicable certainty that something had begun rather than ended. The rain fell harder now, but she scarcely noticed, her mind filled with the image of a man dressed in mourning, holding a letter as though it were both treasure and torment. A letter that, unbeknownst to Clara, would soon call her back to Haversley's shadowed halls. 3 days passed, indistinguishable from one another in their grey monotony, before Clara received the summons. It arrived as she was arranging chrysanthemums for the church altar, a sealed note delivered by a footman whose livery bore the Haldenmere crest, a falcon in flight above a closed gate. "The Duke requests your presence at Haversley Manor at your earliest convenience, miss," the man intoned, his expression betraying neither curiosity nor judgment at this unusual communication. Clara's father observed the exchange from the vestry doorway, his brow furrowed with concern. "What business could the Duke have with you, my dear? He has not called upon anyone in the parish since the late Duchess's passing." "Perhaps it concerns the letter, father," Clara replied, though uncertainty coloured her voice. She had told him of her errand to Haversley, omitting only the strange hollow feeling that had settled in her chest upon her departure. The Reverend Wynn sighed, a sound that spoke of resignation rather than approval. The Duke was once a man of impeccable character, before grief transformed him. Still, propriety must be observed. "I shall accompany you." The Duke specified that Miss Wynn should come alone, sir, the footman interjected, his tone revealing nothing of his thoughts on this unconventional request. Clara felt her father's concern deepen and hastened to reassure him. "I shall be perfectly safe, father. The Duke is a gentleman, and there will be servants present. Perhaps he simply wishes to inquire further about where I found the correspondence." Though reluctant, the Reverend eventually conceded, his paternal anxiety tempered by respect for a man who, despite his recent seclusion, had once been a generous patron of the parish. As Clara approached Haversley for the second time, the manor seemed somehow altered. The curtains had been drawn back from several windows, allowing pale autumn light to penetrate rooms that had too long dwelled in darkness. A gardener knelt among the neglected roses, his shears moving with deliberate precision as he trimmed away the dead growth of seasons past. The door opened before she had opportunity to knock, revealing not the Duke but an elderly gentleman whose dignified bearing and fine attire marked him as neither servant nor guest, but something in between. "Miss Wynn, I presume," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of education and privilege. "I am Sir Edmund Vale, the Duke's solicitor, and if I may be so bold, his friend. His Grace awaits you in the library." Clara followed Sir Edmund through corridors that seemed to breathe the very essence of faded grandeur. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched her passage with painted eyes that held generations of pride and privilege. Somewhere in the depths of the house, she heard the faint notes of a pianoforte, halting, unpracticed, yet undeniably present. "The young Lady Lydia has resumed her music lessons," Sir Edmund remarked, noting Clara's attention to the sound. "A small miracle, I assure you. The child has touched neither key nor string since her aunt's passing." Before Clara could inquire further, they reached a set of mahogany doors which Sir Edmund opened with a gentle knock. The library beyond was a cathedral of knowledge, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes that reached toward the vaulted ceiling. A fire burned in the hearth, casting dancing shadows over the room's sole occupant. The Duke stood by the window, his back to the door, his posture rigid as he gazed out over grounds that had once been the envy of the county. He turned as they entered, and Clara was struck by the subtle change in his countenance. The grief remained, etched in lines that seemed too deep for a man not yet 40, but there was something else, a flicker of awareness, of presence, that had been absent during their first encounter. "Miss Wynn," he acknowledged, with the barest inclination of his head. "Thank you for honoring my request." Sir Edmund cleared his throat discreetly. "I shall be in the study should you require anything, Your Grace." With that, he withdrew, leaving the door slightly ajar, a concession to propriety that Clara noted with silent gratitude. For a long moment, silence reigned, broken only by the gentle crackling of the fire. The Duke seemed to be weighing his words, composing in his mind the speech he wished to deliver. "The letter you returned," he began at last, his voice low but steady, "was written by my late wife, Elizabeth, on the eve of our 5th wedding anniversary. It was never meant to be sent, merely a private expression of sentiments that she found difficult to voice in person." He paused, his gaze returning to the window. "I had thought it lost forever when her writing desk was moved to storage. Your return of it was unexpected but not unwelcome." Clara clasped her hands before her, uncertain how to respond to this confidence. "I am glad the letter found its way back to you, Your Grace." "Yes." The single word held volumes of unspoken emotion. "However, that is not why I asked you here today." He turned fully toward her then, and Clara was struck by how the firelight softened the harsh planes of his face. "My niece, Lady Lydia, has been without proper female guidance since my wife's passing. Her governess departed shortly after the funeral, finding, I suspect, that a house of mourning provides poor employment for one who must instruct in the finer points of feminine accomplishment." Clara's surprise must have shown on her face, for the Duke continued with a hint of what might in another lifetime have been amusement. "You wonder why I would consider the vicar's daughter for such a position. I have made inquiries, Miss Wynn. You were educated at Mrs. Harrington's seminary for young ladies in Bath, were you not?" "I was for 3 years," Clara confirmed, astonished that he had troubled himself to investigate her background. "Then you possess the necessary qualifications to instruct a child in music, drawing, and proper deportment." It was not a question but a statement of fact, delivered with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his assessments accepted without challenge. "The position includes accommodations, a modest stipend, and the use of the library." Clara found herself momentarily speechless. Of all the reasons she had imagined for this summons, an offer of employment had never crossed her mind. "Your Grace, this is most unexpected. Do you find the proposition objectionable?" "Not objectionable, merely surprising. You know nothing of me beyond my act of returning your letter." Something that might have been a smile in a less somber man touched the Duke's lips. "On the contrary, Miss Wynn, that single act revealed a character of honesty and propriety, qualities I value above all others in those who would influence my niece." He hesitated, then added with quiet intensity, "Lydia has not spoken more than necessary words since Elizabeth's passing. Yet this morning, after hearing the pianoforte in the East drawing room, she asked who was playing. When informed it was merely the tuner at his work, she expressed disappointment." Clara understood then what had prompted this unexpected offer. Not her qualifications, modest as they were, but the child's fleeting interest in something beyond her grief, a spark the Duke was desperate to nurture before it faded. "I should need to consult my father," she said at last, though in her heart the decision had already been made. "Of course." The Duke moved to his desk and lifted a small silver bell, which he rang once. The door opened promptly, revealing Sir Edmund, who had clearly been waiting nearby. "Sir Edmund will escort you home and explain the particulars of the position to your father. Should you accept, a carriage will collect you and your belongings on Monday next." As Clara rose to take her leave, the Duke surprised her by extending his hand. Upon his palm rested a small volume bound in blue leather. "Elizabeth's Book of Poetry," he explained, his voice betraying the barest tremor. "Lydia often asked to be read from it. Perhaps you might continue the tradition." Clara accepted the book, understanding the weight of trust it represented. "I shall treat it with the utmost care, Your Grace." As she followed Sir Edmund from the library, she glanced back to see the Duke standing motionless by the fire, his profile etched in golden shadow. In that moment he appeared not as a figure of intimidating nobility, but as a man standing alone against the gathering dark, holding vigil for a light long extinguished. Outside the sky had cleared, revealing a crescent moon that hung like a silver sickle over Haversley's ancient oaks. Sir Edmund assisted Clara into the waiting carriage, his manner courtly yet kind. "You have brought a change to Haversley, Miss Wynn," he remarked as he closed the carriage door. "The first in a very long season." As the carriage began its journey back to the vicarage, Clara opened the book of poetry, its pages redolent with the scent of lavender. A pressed violet fell from between the leaves, its color faded but still discernible against the white of her glove. The carriage rounded a bend, and Haversley disappeared from view. Yet Clara felt with curious certainty that she would soon return, not merely as an employee but as something the grand house had lacked for too long, a breath of life amidst the stillness of grief. Monday arrived with unseasonable warmth, as though summer had returned for a final, fleeting embrace before surrendering to autumn's inevitable advance. Clara stood in the vicarage garden, her single trunk packed and waiting, her father's blessing reluctantly bestowed after lengthy consultation with Sir Edmund regarding the propriety of the arrangement. "Remember who you are, my child," Reverend Wynn advised as they awaited the Duke's carriage. "The daughter of a servant of God, raised in principles of modesty and virtue. The grandeur of Haversley must not turn your head." "I go as a governess, father, not as a guest at a grand ball," Clara replied, though she understood his concern. Tales of the Duke's wealth and position had long been fodder for parish gossip, his status elevated further by the mystery that now surrounded his secluded existence. "My duty is to the child, nothing more. See that it remains so." There was a gravity in her father's tone that Clara found curious, though she had no opportunity to question it, as the Holdenmere carriage appeared at the end of the lane, its polished black surface gleaming in the morning light. The journey to Haversley passed in contemplative silence. Through the carriage window, Clara observed the village recede, the familiar spire of her father's church, the market square where local women gathered to exchange news and wares, the tea room where Mrs. Pembroke presided over gossip as meticulously as she did her china. All the landmarks of her modest life growing distant as she ventured into the unknown. Haversley presented a different aspect in daylight. The grandeur remained, but she noted subtle signs of renewal, windows thrown open to admit air and sunshine, a maid beating carpets in the side garden, the stable boy exercising a magnificent bay horse in the paddock. Small gestures of return to normalcy, yet significant in a house that had been shrouded in stillness. A woman awaited her arrival on the front steps, tall, angular, with hair pulled severely back beneath a starched cap. She introduced herself as Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper, and conducted Clara through the entrance hall with brisk efficiency. "His Grace instructed that you are to have the blue room in the east wing," Mrs. Wilson informed her as they ascended the grand staircase. "It adjoins Lady Lydia's chambers through a connecting door, should she require attention during the night." Clara noted that the portrait she had glimpsed during her first visit, the one draped in black crepe, had been uncovered. The face that gazed out from the gilt frame was that of a woman in her prime, with eyes that seemed to hold both warmth and a hint of melancholy, as though she had foreseen her own early departure from the world. "The late Duchess, Mrs." Wilson confirmed, following Clara's gaze. "Her Grace was a great beauty, and kind-hearted to a fault. The house has not been the same without her laughter." They passed through corridors, adorned with priceless artifacts, Ming vases on marble pedestals, tapestries depicting classical scenes, ancestral portraits that chronicled the Holdenmere lineage through centuries of privilege. Clara felt increasingly aware of her own modest origins, with each step deeper into this world of inherited wealth and position. The blue room, when they reached it, proved to be a chamber of unexpected charm and comfort. Delicate blue silk covered the walls, complementing the deeper azure of the bed hangings. A small writing desk stood before the window, which overlooked the formal gardens, and a modest bookshelf held a carefully selected collection of volumes suitable for a young lady's education. "Lady Lydia takes her lessons in the morning room," Mrs. Wilson explained, gesturing to a bell pull near the fireplace. "Ring when you are settled, and I shall send Annie to escort you. His Grace wishes to speak with you before you meet with the child." Left alone, Clara moved to the window, gazing out at the geometric precision of the gardens below. Topiary shaped into fantastic beasts lined the central path, while marble statues stood sentinel among beds of late-blooming roses. Beyond the formal grounds stretched parkland that seemed to extend to the very horizon, a private kingdom bounded by ancient oaks and iron gates. A soft knock at the connecting door interrupted her reverie. Before she could respond, it opened to reveal the small figure of Lady Lydia, her fair hair loose about her shoulders, her expression a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "You are to be my new governess," the child stated. her voice barely above a whisper. It was not a question but an assessment, delivered with the gravity of one accustomed to the impermanence of human connections. Clara curtsied slightly, acknowledging both the child's rank and her personhood with equal respect. "I am, if you will have me, Lady Lydia. My name is Miss Wynn. You brought Uncle Alaric's letter back to him." "I did," Clara confirmed, surprised by the child's knowledge of this detail. Lydia advanced further into the room, her movements careful, as though she feared disturbing the air itself. "Uncle says you are to teach me music and drawing and deportment." She pronounced the last word with careful precision, clearly repeating what she had been told. "Will you also teach me about flowers?" Aunt Elizabeth knew all the flowers and their meanings. The request, delivered with such solemn hope, touched something in Clara's heart. "I should be delighted to share what knowledge I have of flowers, though I cannot promise to match your aunt's expertise." This candid admission seemed to please rather than disappoint the child. "Then we shall learn together," she decided, with the first hint of animation Clara had observed in her manner. "I have books in the library with pictures of every flower that grows in England." The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor prompted Lydia to retreat hastily toward the connecting door. "Uncle does not know I came to see you first," she confided, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It is to be our secret." With that, she disappeared, closing the door silently behind her, just as a knock sounded from the corridor. Annie, the promised maid, had come to escort Clara to the Duke's study. The study, unlike the library with its imposing grandeur, was a room designed for practical use. Maps of the estate lined one wall, while ledgers and correspondence occupied a large oak desk positioned to catch the morning light. The Duke stood by the hearth, conferring in low tones with Sir Edmund, both men turning as Clara entered. "Miss Wynn," the Duke acknowledged, gesturing for her to be seated in a chair near the fire. "I trust your accommodations are satisfactory." "Most generous, Your Grace," Clara replied, settling her skirts about her with careful modesty. Sir Edmund excused himself with a bow, leaving them alone save for the door left conspicuously ajar, again that concession to propriety that Clara was beginning to recognize as characteristic of the household's careful management of appearances. "Lydia's education has been somewhat irregular since her arrival at Haversley," the Duke began, his tone businesslike. "She resided with her parents in India until their deaths from fever 2 years ago, after which she came into my care. Elizabeth took charge of her instruction, but since—" he paused, the familiar shadow crossing his features. "Since circumstances changed, the child has had only sporadic lessons with the curate from Lower Haversham." Clara noted his avoidance of direct reference to his wife's death, a common practice among those for whom grief remained too raw to be encased in plain language. "May I inquire as to Lady Lydia's particular strengths and inclinations, Your Grace? She has a natural aptitude for music, though little patience for scales and exercises. She draws passably well and reads beyond her years." A hint of what might have been pride softened his stern countenance. "Elizabeth believed she had the makings of a botanist, given her interest in cataloguing every plant in the conservatory." "She mentioned her interest in flowers," Clara confirmed. "I believe it may provide a foundation upon which to build her broader education." The Duke regarded her with renewed attention, as though reassessing his initial judgment. "You propose to teach botany alongside piano sonatas, Miss Wynn?" "I propose to engage her mind through her heart, Your Grace. A child who has known such loss may find solace in subjects that connect her to those she has loved." A lengthy silence followed this observation. The Duke turned toward the window, his profile etched against the morning light, his expression inscrutable. When he spoke again, his voice held a quality Clara had not heard before, a vulnerability beneath the aristocratic reserve. "You speak with unexpected wisdom for one so young, Miss Wynn. Tell me, have you known such loss yourself?" The question, so personal and unexpected, caught Clara unprepared. "My mother passed when I was 12, Your Grace. Not so young as Lady Lydia, but young enough to understand the weight of absence." He nodded, a slight movement that nonetheless conveyed comprehension. "Then perhaps you are indeed the appropriate guide for my niece's education." He returned his attention to the desk, lifting a small leather-bound journal. "Elizabeth kept records of Lydia's progress. You will find her observations illuminating." As Clara accepted the journal, their fingers briefly met. The Duke withdrew his hand as though burned, his composure momentarily fractured by the simple human contact. He recovered swiftly, his features resuming their customary reserve. "You will dine with Lydia in the morning room. Mrs. Wilson will provide a schedule of household routines. Should you require anything for your lessons, inform Sir Edmund." He hesitated, then added, "I dine alone, but I should like a weekly report on my niece's progress." The dismissal was clear, yet as Clara rose to depart, the Duke spoke again, his voice so low she almost missed the words. "She has her mother's eyes, you know. Sometimes it is difficult to meet her gaze." Before Clara could formulate a response to this unexpected confession, a commotion erupted in the corridor, the sound of running feet and a woman's voice raised in alarm. The door burst open, revealing Mrs. Wilson in a state of uncharacteristic disarray. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but Lady Lydia—" She broke off, her distress evident. The Duke crossed the room in 3 swift strides. "What of her? Speak plainly, woman." "She was in the conservatory, sir, and that creature, the cat from the stables, it knocked over the Duke of Wellington." Clara's confusion must have shown on her face, for Mrs. Wilson hastened to explain. "The aloe vera plant, miss. Her ladyship named all the plants, and now she's locked herself in the conservatory, refusing to come out or let anyone in." The Duke's expression darkened. "The plant was Elizabeth's. She brought it from the glass houses at Chatsworth before our marriage." Understanding dawned on Clara. The breaking of the pot represented far more than a gardening mishap to a child already burdened with loss. "May I, Your Grace?" she asked, already moving toward the door. He hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Mrs. Wilson will show you the way." The conservatory occupied the eastern wing of Haversley, a cathedral of glass and iron that housed specimens from across the empire. At its center stood a marble fountain where water trickled over carved lotus blossoms, filling the humid air with gentle music. But it was the small figure huddled beside an overturned pot that drew Clara's immediate attention. Lydia knelt amid soil and broken pottery, her fingers desperately trying to gather the scattered earth around the exposed roots of a young aloe plant. Tears streamed down her face, unchecked and unheeded as she worked. "She will die now," the child whispered as Clara approached, not looking up from her task. "Just like Aunt Elizabeth and Mama and Papa. Everything dies." Clara knelt beside her, heedless of the soil that stained her skirts. "Not everything, Lady Lydia. And certainly not this plant." With gentle hands, she began to help gather the soil. "Aloe is remarkably resilient. With proper care, it will thrive again." "Promise?" Lydia looked up at last, her eyes wide with desperate hope. "I promise," Clara replied, knowing as she spoke that her pledge extended beyond the fate of a single plant. "Now let us find a new pot for the Duke of Wellington, shall we? I believe he would look most distinguished in blue ceramic, don't you agree?" A tremulous smile appeared on the child's tear-stained face, the first true smile Clara had witnessed since her arrival at Haversley. "Aunt Elizabeth said he was too noble for anything but the finest porcelain." "Then porcelain it shall be," Clara declared, rising and offering her hand. "Shall we ask Mrs. Wilson where such a worthy vessel might be found?" Lydia placed her small hand in Clara's with unexpected trust. "You won't leave? Even though I've been crying and made a dreadful mess?" "I shall not leave," Clara assured her, the simple promise carrying weight beyond the immediate moment. Neither of them noticed the Duke standing in the shadowed doorway, watching this exchange with an expression of mingled surprise and something that, had he allowed himself to name it, might have been hope. As Clara led Lydia from the conservatory, the Duke withdrew, unseen and unacknowledged. Yet when he returned to his study, he found himself pausing before the portrait of his late wife that hung above the mantel. "She has a way with the child, Elizabeth," he murmured to the painted image. "Perhaps you would approve." The portrait, of course, made no reply. But for the first time in months, the silence that followed did not seem quite so absolute. A fortnight passed, marked by the steady rhythm of lessons and small cautious steps toward normalcy within Haversley's walls. Clara found in Lydia an eager pupil, her natural curiosity emerging from beneath the shroud of grief that had too long constrained her spirit. The morning room, once a silent monument to abandoned pursuits, now resonated with scales and arpeggios, recitations of poetry, and earnest discussions of botany. The Duke remained largely absent from these daily activities, glimpsed only at a distance, as he rode across his estates or conferred with tenants in the library. Yet Clara sensed his awareness of every development in his niece's education, noting how the requested supplies for their lessons appeared with remarkable swiftness, and how the library table often bore books relevant to their current studies, left casually open as though abandoned mid-reading. "Uncle has always watched from shadows," Lydia confided one afternoon as they pressed flowers for her herbarium. "Aunt Elizabeth said it was because he felt too deeply to show it plainly." Clara, who had begun to form her own impressions of the Duke's character, found this assessment unexpectedly illuminating. Some hearts are like certain flowers, Lady Lydia. They close their petals against too direct a light. Like night-blooming jasmine. The child agreed with the solemnity of true understanding. Aunt Elizabeth planted some beneath her window, but it died last winter when no one remembered to cover it against the frost. This casual mention of neglect in the wake of loss spoke volumes about the household's descent into grief-stricken disarray. Clara made a mental note to inquire whether the conservatory might yield cuttings for a new planting. A small restoration, perhaps, but symbolic nonetheless. It was on the third Wednesday of her employment that Clara encountered the first significant disruption to the tentative peace they had established. She had taken Lydia to the village for new hair ribbons, a modest excursion approved by Mrs. Wilson as beneficial to the child's reintroduction to society. They were examining a display of silks at Mr. Thompson's haberdashery when a voice cut through the quiet murmur of commerce. "Why, Lady Lydia Holdenmere, as I live and breathe, and in the village no less. How the Duke must have relaxed his guard to permit such an outing." The woman who approached was perhaps 30, attired in a gown of lavender silk that, while undeniably elegant, seemed excessive for village errands. Her golden hair was arranged in an elaborate coiffure adorned with pearl-tipped pins, and her smile, though perfectly formed, failed to reach her calculating blue eyes. "Mrs. Tolland," Lydia acknowledged, with a curtsy that spoke of rigorous training. "How do you do?" "I am exceedingly well, child, though bereft of company these many months." The woman's gaze shifted to Clara, assessing her modest attire with a single sweeping glance. "And who might this be? Surely not a relation I have failed to recognize." Clara felt Lydia press closer to her side, a subtle indication of discomfort that prompted a protective response. "Miss Clara Wynn, ma'am. I have the honor of serving as Lady Lydia's governess." "A governess?" Mrs. Tolland's eyebrows arched in exaggerated surprise. "How novel. I had thought the position quite impossible to fill, given the peculiar atmosphere at Haversley since poor Elizabeth's passing." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say the Duke permits no laughter within those walls, that he roams the corridors at night like some spectre from a Gothic tale." "Uncle reads to me every Thursday evening," Lydia interjected with unexpected spirit. "Last week it was The Tempest, and he did all the voices, even Ariel's." This revelation of domestic intimacy seemed to catch Mrs. Tolland off guard, her composure momentarily faltering before her smile reasserted itself with redoubled brilliance. "How delightful! The Duke was always a man of hidden talents. I recall how he would recite Byron at the Militons musicales before his marriage, of course." The emphasis placed on the Duke's premarital activities carried a weight of implication that Clara found distasteful. "We must be returning to Haversley, Lady Lydia. Your music practice awaits." "Oh, but you must convey my warmest regards to the Duke," Mrs. Tolland insisted, placing a gloved hand on Clara's arm with false familiarity. "Remind him that the harvest ball at Tolland Park is but a fortnight hence. Tradition demands the Duke's presence, regardless of his current predilections for solitude." "I shall ensure His Grace receives your message, Mrs. Tolland," Clara replied, her tone deliberately neutral despite her growing discomfort with the woman's transparent manipulations. Mrs. Tolland's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "See that you do, Miss Wynn, and perhaps suggest that Lady Lydia might benefit from more varied society than that found within Haversley's somewhat austere confines." With that parting barb, she swept from the shop in a rustle of expensive fabric, leaving behind the cloying scent of imported perfume and an atmosphere of subtle discord. Lydia remained unusually quiet on their return journey, her small face pensive as she gazed out the carriage window at the passing landscape. Only as they approached Haversley's gates did she break her silence. "Mrs. Tolland wanted to marry Uncle after Aunt Elizabeth died. I heard the servants talking." Clara, startled by this forthright observation, searched for an appropriate response. "It is not uncommon for widowed gentlemen to receive such attention, Lady Lydia. But Uncle didn't want to marry her," the child continued with the relentless honesty of youth. "He said she had the moral compass of a weather vane and the depth of a puddle after light rain." A startled laugh escaped Clara before she could suppress it, the Duke's acerbic assessment, so at odds with his public persona of rigid formality. "Such observations are perhaps best not repeated in company, my dear." "Aunt Elizabeth said the same, only with different words," Lydia confided, a shadow of her former mischievousness brightening her features. "She called Mrs. Tolland a gilded butterfly with venom in her wings." The carriage passed through the gates, gravel crunching beneath its wheels as they approached the house. Clara was contemplating how best to guide the conversation toward more appropriate topics when she noticed an unfamiliar figure on the front steps, a man of medium height with a walking stick, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Sir Edmund. As their carriage drew to a halt, the stranger turned, revealing a face that might have been handsome were it not for the calculating coldness of his gaze. His attire proclaimed both wealth and an awareness of fashion that bordered on the ostentatious, from his perfectly tied cravat to the gleaming gold fob that dangled from his waistcoat pocket. "Lord Rowe," Lydia whispered, shrinking back into the carriage seat, her earlier animation vanishing like morning mist before harsh sun. "He was Papa's friend in India, but Uncle doesn't like him." Before Clara could inquire further, the gentleman in question approached the carriage, a smile of practiced charm spreading across his features. "Lady Lydia, what a fortunate encounter. I had called to pay my respects to your guardian, only to find him inconveniently absent on estate business." His gaze shifted to Clara, sharpening with interest as he assessed her simple but tasteful attire. "And this must be the new governess I have heard mentioned in certain circles. Miss Wynn, is it not? Vincent Rowe at your service." He executed a bow of precise depth, neither too familiar nor excessively formal. Clara acknowledged the introduction with a reserved inclination of her head, instinctively placing herself between Lord Rowe and her charge as they descended from the carriage. "Lord Rowe, I regret the Duke is not available to receive you." "A common occurrence, I fear," he replied, his tone suggesting a familiarity with the household that Clara suspected was exaggerated. "However, fortune smiles upon me in the form of your return. Perhaps you might convey to His Grace that I have certain papers that may interest him, documents pertaining to his late brother's affairs in Bombay." Something in his manner, a calculated intensity beneath the veneer of cordiality, raised Clara's guard. "I shall inform His Grace of your visit, my lord." "See that you do, Miss Wynn." His smile remained fixed, but his eyes held a warning. Some matters cannot be indefinitely postponed, however much the Duke might wish to dwell in splendid isolation. With a final bow that somehow managed to be both courteous and vaguely threatening, Lord Rowe took his leave, his carriage departing down the drive with a speed that suggested suppressed anger beneath his composed exterior. Sir Edmund approached as the dust settled, his usual placid demeanour disturbed by faint lines of concern around his mouth. "Miss Wynn, Lady Lydia, I trust your excursion to the village was pleasant." "We encountered Mrs. Tolland," Lydia offered by way of explanation, her tone suggesting this fact alone negated any possibility of true enjoyment. A flicker of understanding crossed the solicitor's features. "Ah, yes. The lady has been most persistent in her inquiries regarding Haversley's activities of late." He turned to Clara, lowering his voice slightly. "The Duke has returned and requests your presence in the library, Miss Wynn. A matter concerning Lady Lydia's education, I believe." Clara sensed there was more to this summons than a discussion of curriculum, particularly given the timing of Lord Rowe's departure. "Of course. Lady Lydia, perhaps you might show Mrs. Wilson your new ribbons while I speak with your uncle?" The child nodded, her expression betraying both relief at being excused from immediate discussion of their encounters and curiosity about what might transpire in the library. Clara watched her ascend the steps with Mrs. Wilson, noting how the child's posture had improved in recent weeks, a small but significant sign of returning confidence. "A word of caution, Miss Wynn," Sir Edmund murmured as he escorted her toward the library. "The Duke holds Lord Rowe in particular disfavour, for reasons he has not shared even with me. It would be wise to relate the encounter factually, without embellishment." "Thank you for the guidance, Sir Edmund," Clara replied, wondering at the undercurrents that seemed to swirl beneath Haversley's placid surface. "I shall bear it in mind." The library door stood ajar, revealing the Duke standing before the hearth, his posture suggesting the contained energy of a man restraining powerful emotion. As Clara entered, he turned, and she was struck by the intensity of his gaze, as though he sought to read not merely her words but the thoughts behind them. "Miss Wynn," he acknowledged, gesturing for her to be seated, "I understand you encountered certain individuals during your excursion to the village." "Yes, Your Grace," Clara confirmed, settling her skirts as she took the offered chair. "Both Mrs. Tolland and, upon our return, Lord Rowe." A muscle tightened in the Duke's jaw at the mention of the second name. "And what, pray tell, did Lord Rowe have to say for himself?" Clara chose her words with care, mindful of Sir Edmund's warning. "He mentioned papers concerning your late brother's affairs in Bombay, Your Grace. Documents he suggested might be of interest to you." Did he indeed? The Duke's voice remained level, but Clara sensed the effort it cost him. And did his lordship elaborate on the nature of these supposed documents? No, your grace. He merely expressed that some matters cannot be indefinitely postponed. A humorless smile touched the Duke's lips, a sentiment with which I am painfully familiar, particularly when delivered by Vincent Rowe. He turned away, gazing into the fire as though seeking answers in its dancing flames. You should know, Miss Wynn, that Lord Rowe's connection to my family is complicated. He served with my brother in India, true enough, but their association was not one I endorsed. Clara remained silent, sensing that the Duke was measuring his words carefully, revealing only what he deemed necessary, while withholding the deeper truth that clearly troubled him. As for Mrs. Toland, he continued after a moment, I presume she extended an invitation to the harvest ball at Toland Park. She did, your grace. She spoke of tradition requiring your attendance. Tradition, he repeated, the word carrying a weight of irony. Beatrice Toland's reverence for tradition extends precisely as far as it serves her ambitions. He turned back to Clara, his expression softening slightly. However, in this particular instance, she is not entirely incorrect. The harvest ball has been a fixture of county society for generations, and my absence these past months has been noted. A sudden realization dawned on Clara. You intend to attend, your grace? I do, and I should like Lady Lydia to accompany me. He hesitated, then added with careful formality. Your presence would also be required, Miss Wynn, as her chaperone and guide. The child has not attended such a gathering since before her parents' passing. The invitation, for it was an invitation despite its phrasing as a statement of necessity, caught Clara entirely unprepared. I fear I am not equipped for such an occasion, your grace. My wardrobe is suited to a governess's duties, not a county ball. That concern is easily addressed, the Duke replied with unexpected promptness, as though he had anticipated this objection. Mrs. Wilson will arrange for the dressmaker in Lower Havisham to attend you tomorrow. I shall, of course, bear the expense, as your attendance is at my request. Clara felt a flutter of alarm at the prospect of accepting such a significant gift from her employer, aware of how such an arrangement might appear to observers like Mrs. Toland, whose sharp eyes missed no opportunity for malicious speculation. Your Grace, I cannot accept. You can, and you will, Miss Wynn, he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. Consider it a necessity of your position rather than a personal indulgence. Lydia's comfort at this event is paramount, and your familiar presence will provide the security she requires to navigate her reintroduction to society. Put in such terms as duty rather than favor, Clara found her objections difficult to maintain. As you wish, your grace, I shall endeavor to be a credit to Haversley. Something flickered in the Duke's eyes. Approval, perhaps, or possibly amusement at her formal acquiescence. I have no doubt of that, Miss Wynn. You have already proven yourself more than equal to the challenges Haversley presents. The conversation concluded shortly thereafter, the Duke returning to his correspondence with the clear expectation that Clara would see to Lydia's preparation for the coming event. As she rose to take her leave, however, he spoke again, his voice softer than before. One final matter, Miss Wynn. Should Lord Rowe attempt to communicate with you directly on any subject, I would consider it a personal favor if you would inform me immediately. The request, delivered with quiet intensity, hinted at concerns far deeper than mere social antipathy. Of course, Your Grace. Clara departed the library with her thoughts in turmoil, sensing that she stood at the edge of matters far more complex than the education of a motherless child. As she climbed the stairs to the east wing, she caught sight of a figure at the far end of the corridor. Lord Rowe engaged in hushed conversation with a housemaid, whose flushed countenance suggested either embarrassment or alarm. The man looked up, meeting Clara's gaze with a smile that chilled her blood, despite the afternoon warmth. With a slight bow in her direction, he turned and descended the servants' staircase, leaving the maid staring after him with an expression Clara could not quite decipher. The harvest ball at Toland Park, it seemed, would be but one of many challenges awaiting in the days to come. The dressmaker arrived the following morning, a diminutive Frenchwoman with nimble fingers and an authoritative manner that brooked no argument, even from one as exalted as the Duke of Haldenmere. Madame Fournier swept into the blue room like a general surveying contested territory, her assessing gaze taking in Clara's modest figure and simple attire with professional detachment. Mademoiselle has excellent posture and a natural grace, she pronounced after circling Clara 3 times, pincushion in hand. A pity to hide such attributes beneath institutional grey and navy. The Duke was most specific in his instructions. Clothing befitting a lady of gentle birth. We shall commence immediately. Before Clara could formulate a protest, she found herself standing amidst a sea of fabric samples, swatches of lace, and sketches of fashionable silhouettes. Madame Fournier dismissed her concerns regarding modesty and propriety with a Gallic shrug. The Duke has commissioned 3 ensembles, a day dress, an evening gown for the ball, and a walking costume. All shall be elegant, yet appropriate for your position. I understand the delicacy of your situation, mademoiselle. This last statement, delivered with surprising sympathy, suggested the Frenchwoman comprehended more than merely Clara's measurements. You have served Haversley before? Clara inquired, as Madame marked alterations on a pattern. I dressed the late Duchess from her debut until... Madame crossed herself quickly. A woman of exquisite taste and kindness. The Duke honored her memory by closing the house to all celebration, but now perhaps he begins to see that life must continue. She pinned a length of midnight blue silk against Clara's shoulder, nodding with satisfaction at the effect. This shade, it brings color to your cheeks and depth to your eyes. We shall make it the ball gown, with silver embroidery at the bodice and hem. The color seems rather bold for a governess, Clara ventured, though she could not deny the beauty of the fabric as it caught the morning light. Nonsense. It is dignified, elegant, and entirely proper. Madame stepped back, her head tilted critically. The Duchess would have approved. She always said that true modesty lies in behavior, not in drab attire. The mention of Elizabeth Holdenmere's philosophy regarding dress reminded Clara of the blue-bound volume of poetry still in her possession. Each night before retiring, she read a selection to Lydia, noting which verses seemed to resonate most deeply with the child. Increasingly, she found herself wondering about the woman who had selected these poems. What sort of person had captured the heart of a man like the Duke and won the devoted affection of a child not her own? Throughout the day, as Madame Fournier measured and pinned and sketched, Clara's thoughts returned to the approaching ball and the Duke's unexpected decision to emerge from seclusion. What had prompted this change? Was it merely, as he suggested, a concession to tradition and social obligation, or had something, perhaps Lord Rowe's mysterious documents, forced his hand in some way? These questions remained unanswered as the week progressed, and the household began subtle preparations for their public reappearance. The Duke's valet was observed pressing formal attire that had long hung untouched in the master's wardrobe. Mrs. Wilson directed a thorough cleaning of the family carriage, its crest polished until it gleamed like new minted gold. Sir Edmund was closeted with the Duke for hours each afternoon, emerging with documents to be dispatched by courier to London. Lydia, meanwhile, approached the prospect of the ball with a mixture of excitement and trepidation that manifested in fitful sleep and distracted lessons. "Will there be dancing, Miss Wynn?" she asked as Clara helped her practice a simple cotillion in the morning room. "Aunt Elizabeth taught me the steps, but I have never performed them properly." "I expect there will be dancing early in the evening before the younger guests retire," Clara assured her, guiding the child through a turn. "And you shall acquit yourself beautifully, Lady Lydia. But what if I forget the steps? What if I step on someone's toes or trip on my gown?" The anxiety in the child's voice betrayed deeper fears than mere social embarrassment, the terror of public failure, of disappointing the guardian whose approval she so desperately sought. Clara knelt before her, taking the small hands in her own. "Listen carefully, my dear. Everyone forgets steps occasionally, even the finest dancers in London. The secret is not in perfect execution, but in recovery. A smile, a graceful acknowledgement, and then continuing as though nothing were amiss. Is that what Aunt Elizabeth did when she made mistakes?" The question carried a weight beyond its simple phrasing, a child seeking connection to a vanished maternal figure through shared human fallibility. "I cannot say with certainty," Clara replied honestly, "but based on the woman revealed in her poetry and in your memories, I believe she faced life's missteps with precisely such grace." This answer seemed to satisfy Lydia, who resumed her practice with renewed determination. The incident left Clara reflecting once again on the absent presence that still defined Haversley, the woman whose taste had selected each painting, whose hands had arranged flowers in crystal vases, whose laughter, according to Mrs. Wilson, had once filled corridors now shrouded in respectful silence. The evening before the ball brought Madame Fournier's completed creations, delivered with appropriate ceremony by the dressmaker herself. The midnight blue gown exceeded even Clara's expectations, simple in its lines, yet elevated by exquisite workmanship and thoughtful details that spoke of Madame's understanding of her client's position. High-necked and long-sleeved, it offered perfect propriety, while the subtle silver embroidery at cuffs and hem provided just enough adornment to distinguish it from ordinary evening wear. "The Duke has excellent taste," Madame remarked, as Clara stood before the looking-glass, amazed at the transformation a well-cut gown could effect. "He selected the fabric himself from my samples." This revelation startled Clara, who had assumed the Duke's involvement extended no further than financial authorization. "His Grace took personal interest in the commission? But of course, he is a man of discernment in all things, mademoiselle. The blue complements your coloring perfectly, as I knew it would." Madame adjusted the fall of the skirt with practiced hands. "Now a simple arrangement of your hair, perhaps with silver ribbons, and you shall do credit to Haversley tomorrow evening." After Madame's departure, Clara remained before the mirror, studying her reflection with newfound uncertainty. The woman who gazed back at her seemed a stranger, not the vicar's daughter educated for modest service, but someone who might, in another life, have moved naturally in the circles she was about to enter under false pretenses. For the gown, beautiful as it was, represented a fiction, a costume that disguised her true station for the convenience of her employer. A soft knock at the connecting door interrupted these troubling reflections. Lydia entered, her nightgown trailing behind her like a modest train, her expression eager yet hesitant. "May I see your ball gown, Miss Wynn? Annie said it was delivered this afternoon." Clara gestured toward the gown, now carefully laid across her bed. "What do you think, Lady Lydia? Is it suitable for a governess at her first county ball?" The child approached the garment with reverent hands, her fingertips tracing the silver embroidery. "It's the color of the night sky just before the stars appear," she said softly. "Aunt Elizabeth had a gown this color, but with gold instead of silver. Uncle said it made her look like the evening star." This innocent observation rekindled Clara's unease. Had the Duke selected the fabric because it reminded him of his late wife? Was she, unconsciously, being cast as some pale reflection of the woman whose absence still haunted Haversley? "Miss Wynn," Lydia's voice drew her back from these disquieting thoughts. "Are you nervous about the ball?" "I am, terribly." Clara smiled, setting aside her concerns to focus on the child's more immediate anxieties. "A little nervousness is perfectly natural before any new experience, Lady Lydia. But remember, I shall be with you throughout the evening and your uncle will be nearby." "Uncle says Mrs. Tolland will try to monopolize his attention," Lydia confided, settling onto the window seat with the familiarity of habit. "He told Sir Edmund he would rather converse with the garden statuary, as the stone figures possess both greater intelligence and superior moral character." This frank assessment of the lady of Tolland Park, delivered in Lydia's perfect mimicry of the Duke's aristocratic drawl, startled a laugh from Clara. "Your uncle's observations on Mrs. Tolland's character are perhaps best not repeated in public, my dear." "That's what Sir Edmund said," Lydia agreed solemnly. "He told Uncle that whatever his private opinions, courtesy required him to stand up with Mrs. Tolland for at least one dance, as she is the hostess." The thought of the Duke, still formally in mourning participating in the festivities, seemed incongruous with the man Clara had come to know, a figure of austere dignity who moved through life with careful restraint. Yet if he intended to re-enter society, certain concessions to its customs would indeed be necessary. "Will you dance, Miss Wynn?" Lydia asked, yawning despite her evident interest in the upcoming festivities. "Governesses rarely participate in such activities," Clara explained gently. "My role is to ensure your comfort and enjoyment, not to engage in the entertainments myself." Lydia's brow furrowed in the expression Clara had come to recognize as her precursor to stubborn argument. "But that's not fair. You dance beautifully, much better than I do, and your gown is the prettiest one at Haversley." "Thank you for the compliment, but the proprieties must be observed." Clara rose, guiding Lydia toward the connecting door. "Now to bed with you. Tomorrow will be a long day and you need your rest." After settling the child in her chamber, Clara returned to find an envelope had been slipped beneath her door during her brief absence. The Duke's seal, a falcon above a closed gate, pressed into dark green wax, secured the missive. Within, she found a brief note in a bold, masculine hand. "Miss Wynn, a carriage will collect you and Lydia at 7 tomorrow evening. Sir Edmund will escort you to Tolland Park, as I must depart earlier to attend to certain matters with our hostess. Regarding the ball, I ask that you remain vigilant. Recent events have convinced me that certain parties with ill intent may be present. Should Lord Rowe approach either you or Lydia, withdraw immediately and inform Sir Edmund or myself. Your discretion in this matter is appreciated. Haldenmere, the note, with its cryptic warning and formal brevity, offered no illumination regarding the Duke's concerns, only confirmation that the undercurrents Clara had sensed were real rather than imagined. She placed the letter in her writing desk, turning the key in the lock with unusual care. As she prepared for bed, extinguishing the lamps one by one until only the moonlight remained, Clara found herself standing by the window that overlooked Haversley's formal gardens. In the silver illumination, the marble statues stood like sentinels among shadowed topiary, while the fountain at the garden's center cast a plume of liquid diamond against the night sky. Movement near the rose arbor caught her eye, a tall figure walking alone, head bowed as though in contemplation or prayer. The Duke, his unmistakable silhouette outlined against the pale gravel path, paused before a stone bench partially concealed by climbing roses. He remained there, motionless, for what seemed an eternity before continuing his solitary circuit of the garden. Clara drew back from the window, troubled by the sense that she had witnessed something intensely private, a moment of vulnerability the Duke would not willingly have revealed. As she slipped between cool linen sheets, her thoughts returned to the mysterious warning in his note and the subtle tensions that seemed to permeate Haversley like mist among the ancient oaks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: a public appearance, the scrutiny of county society, the navigation of social currents she only dimly perceived. Yet, as sleep finally claimed her, Clara's last conscious thought was not of the ball or its potential complications, but of a solitary figure walking in moonlight, bearing a burden he seemed unwilling or unable to share. The day of the harvest ball dawned with a perfect autumn crispness that belied the tension gathering within Haversley's walls. Clara rose early, determined to maintain Lydia's routine despite the evening's impending disruption. They breakfasted in the morning room as usual, followed by 2 hours of concentrated study, mathematics and French, before the afternoon's preparations would claim their attention. "You seem distracted, Miss Wynn," Lydia observed as Clara absently marked an incorrect sum without comment. "Are you thinking about the ball?" Clara, startled by the child's perception, smiled ruefully. "I confess my thoughts were wandering. The problem with 7 apples and 9 oranges deserves more attention than I was giving it." "I don't mind," Lydia assured her, clearly eager to abandon arithmetic for more engaging topics. "I've been thinking about the ball too. Annie says that all the county families will attend, and that Mrs. Tolland has hired musicians from Bath to play for the dancing. It promises to be a splendid affair," Clara agreed, gently redirecting the child's attention to her workbook. "But before we can enjoy the evening's festivities, we must complete our morning's obligations." They had just concluded their lessons when a commotion in the entrance hall drew their attention. The sound of voices raised in uncharacteristic excitement, followed by hurried footsteps on the grand staircase. Clara opened the morning room door to find Mrs. Wilson directing a flurry of activity as footmen carried trunks and hat boxes toward the east wing. "What's happening?" Lydia asked, peering around Clara with undisguised curiosity. "Lady Haldenmere has arrived," Mrs. Wilson explained, her usual composure somewhat ruffled by this unexpected development. "The Dowager Duchess," she added, noting Clara's momentary confusion. "His Grace's mother." This announcement was followed almost immediately by the appearance of the lady herself, a diminutive figure who nonetheless commanded attention through sheer force of presence. Despite being well into her 6th decade, the Dowager Duchess of Haldenmere carried herself with the upright posture of a much younger woman. Her traveling costume of deep burgundy velvet complemented her silver hair, which was arranged in an elegant style that defied the current fashion, yet suited her perfectly. "Grandmother!" Lydia's exclamation held genuine delight as she rushed forward to embrace the older woman. "You've come for the ball." "Indeed I have, child," the Dowager confirmed, her voice carrying the faintest hint of a Scottish burr. "Though in truth it was news of your musical progress that hastened my journey from Edinburgh. Your uncle's letters have been most encouraging regarding your recent accomplishments." This reference to correspondence from the Duke surprised Clara, who had not realized he maintained such detailed communication with his mother regarding Lydia's education. Before she could reflect further on this revelation, the Dowager's keen gaze shifted to her. "And you must be Miss Wynn." It was not a question, but an assessment, delivered with the same direct scrutiny the Duke often employed. "Alaric writes that you have brought considerable improvement to my granddaughter's spirits," Clara cursed, feeling suddenly and acutely aware of her position as an employee being evaluated. "Your Grace is most kind, Lady Lydia is a naturally gifted pupil whose progress reflects her own determination. A glimmer of approval appeared in the dowager's dark eyes, so like her son's in their penetrating intensity. Well said, Miss Wynn. False modesty and excessive self-deprecation are tedious qualities in a young woman. I am pleased to find you possess neither. With that enigmatic commendation, the dowager turned her attention back to Lydia, inquiring about specific musical pieces and whether the child still enjoyed botanical drawing. As they conversed, Clara observed the genuine affection between grandmother and granddaughter, a relationship clearly nurtured despite geographical separation. Mrs. Wilson approached discreetly, informing Clara that the Duke requested her presence in the library at her earliest convenience. Excusing herself from the reunion, Clara made her way through corridors that seemed unusually animated with preparation for the evening ahead. Footmen polished silver, maids adjusted flower arrangements, and the faint scent of beeswax polish perfumed the air, Haversley awakening from its long slumber of morning. The library door stood open, revealing the Duke in conversation with Sir Edmund. Both men turned as she entered, the Duke beckoning her forward with uncharacteristic urgency. "Miss Wynn, I apologize for the interruption to your schedule. You have met my mother." "Briefly, Your Grace, she was becoming reacquainted with Lady Lydia when I received your summons." The Duke nodded, seemingly satisfied by this report. "My mother's arrival, while welcome, necessitates certain adjustments to our arrangements for this evening. She will, of course, accompany us to Tolland Park, which provides additional protection for Lydia." Clara noted the choice of word. Protection, not supervision or company. Another hint at concerns beyond mere social propriety. "I am glad Lady Lydia will have the comfort of her grandmother's presence." "Indeed." The Duke hesitated, exchanging a glance with Sir Edmund before continuing. "However, my mother's arrival introduces a complication. Protocol dictates that, as Dowager Duchess, she must travel in the family carriage with Lydia and myself. Sir Edmund, who was to escort you, is now required to attend to a legal matter that cannot be postponed." Clara immediately understood the implied dilemma. "I shall, of course, remain at Haversley, Your Grace. Lady Lydia will be well supervised by yourself and her Grace." "That is not my intention," the Duke countered, his tone suggesting mild irritation that she had leapt to this conclusion. "Lydia has set her heart on your presence, and in truth I believe it would benefit her to have your steady influence amidst what promises to be a somewhat overwhelming occasion." Sir Edmund cleared his throat discreetly. "Perhaps Miss Wynn might travel with Dr. Harrington and his wife. They pass Haversley on their way to Tolland Park, and I believe Mrs. Harrington was once acquainted with the Reverend Wynn." "A sensible solution," the Duke agreed, turning to Clara with a questioning look. "Would such an arrangement be acceptable to you, Miss Wynn?" "Perfectly acceptable, Your Grace," Clara replied, relieved that her attendance would not require any improper compromise of propriety. "I am acquainted with Mrs. Harrington through my father's parish work." The matter thus settled, Clara expected to be dismissed. Instead, the Duke moved to his desk and retrieved a small Morocco leather box, which he extended toward her with an air of slight discomfort. "One final matter. This belongs to the Haldenmere collection, a family piece rarely worn since my grandmother's time. My mother suggested it might complement your gown this evening." Clara accepted the box with hesitant hands, opening it to reveal a delicate silver filigree necklace set with midnight blue sapphires that precisely matched the shade of her ball gown. The workmanship was exquisite, clearly the product of a master jeweler from an earlier age, when craftsmanship valued artistry above ostentation. "Your Grace, this is—" she faltered, overcome by the unexpected honor this loan represented. "I cannot accept such responsibility. The value alone—" "Is considerable, yes," the Duke interrupted, "but hardly comparable to the service you have rendered in restoring my niece's spirits. Consider it a token of the family's appreciation, to be worn tonight and returned thereafter. Put in such terms, refusal would seem ungracious, even ungrateful. I shall guard it with the utmost care, Your Grace." A shadow of what might have been amusement touched his features. "See that you do, Miss Wynn. The piece is over a century old and survived both the French Revolution and my grandmother's notorious clumsiness. It would be a pity to see its history end at a harvest ball in rural England." This unexpected display of dry wit, so at odds with the Duke's usual grave demeanor, caught Clara entirely unprepared. A startled laugh escaped her before she could suppress it, earning her a raised eyebrow from Sir Edmund and, more surprisingly, the ghost of a smile from the Duke himself. "Thank you, Your Grace. I shall endeavor to preserve its distinguished history." The remainder of the day passed in a flurry of preparation. Clara assisted Lydia with her toilette, a task normally assigned to Annie, but which the child had specifically requested her governess perform. As she secured white rosebuds in Lydia's fair hair, Clara found herself reflecting on the curious position in which she now found herself, neither family nor servant, but occupying some undefined middle ground that allowed her privileged glimpses into both worlds. The Dowager Duchess appeared as they completed their preparations, her approving nod a benediction on their efforts. "You have done well with her, Miss Wynn," she observed, as Lydia twirled to display her cream silk gown with its pale blue sash. Elizabeth would have been pleased. This mention of the late Duchess, offered simply, without the hushed reverence that typically accompanied her name within Haversley's walls, struck Clara as significant. The Dowager, it seemed, had moved beyond the acute phase of grief into a place where fond memory could exist without accompanying pain. "Thank you, Your Grace." "That is high praise indeed." The Dowager's keen gaze assessed Clara with renewed interest. "You have not yet met my son in his formal attire, I think. Prepare yourself, Miss Wynn. Alaric in evening dress has been known to render even the most composed young ladies temporarily insensible." This unexpected sally, delivered with a twinkle in eyes remarkably similar to her son's, left Clara momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a suitable response, a maid announced that Dr. and Mrs. Harrington's carriage had arrived. The entrance hall presented a scene of unusual animation as Clara descended the grand staircase. Footmen in full livery stood at attention, while Mrs. Wilson conducted a final inspection of the Duke's carriage, ensuring that no detail had been overlooked. Sir Edmund, attired for his legal errand rather than the evening's festivities, offered Clara a reassuring smile as she approached. "The Harringtons are most pleased to offer you conveyance, Miss Wynn. They speak highly of your father's sermons." Clara was about to respond when the Duke emerged from his study, and she understood instantly what had prompted the Dowager's teasing warning. Alaric Holdenmere in full evening dress was, indeed, a sight to give pause to the female heart. The severe black of his tailcoat emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the leanness of his waist, while the starched white of his cravat provided dramatic contrast to the bronzed skin of his face. His only concession to adornment was a single diamond pin securing his cravat, a restrained elegance that spoke of confidence rather than ostentation. He paused briefly upon seeing Clara, his gaze taking in her transformed appearance with an expression she could not quite decipher. For a moment, brief yet strangely extended, they regarded one another across the entrance hall, two people whose circumstances had forced an intimacy of acquaintance that social convention would otherwise have forbidden. The spell was broken by Lydia's appearance at the top of the stairs, her excited voice calling down to her uncle as she prepared to make her entrance. The Duke's attention immediately shifted to his niece, his features softening as he extended his arm to receive her. Clara took advantage of this diversion to slip outside to the waiting Harrington carriage, her heart beating with inexplicable rapidity. As she settled into the comfortable interior, exchanging polite greetings with the doctor and his wife, she touched the sapphire necklace at her throat, a tangible reminder of her borrowed status in a world where she did not truly belong. The journey to Tolland Park passed pleasantly enough, Mrs. Harrington proving an amiable companion, whose gentle inquiries about Clara's father and the parish occupied the time without straying into uncomfortable personal territory. As they approached their destination, however, Clara's apprehension returned with renewed force. Tolland Park blazed with light, every window of the Palladian mansion illuminated as if in defiance of the gathering dusk. Carriages lined the circular drive, disgorging elegantly attired guests who ascended the marble steps with anticipatory smiles. Footmen in elaborate livery directed new arrivals, while the sound of an orchestra tuning drifted through open doors. "Quite the spectacle," Dr. Harrington remarked as their carriage joined the queue. "Beatrice Tolland has spared no expense this year. One might almost suspect she has a particular reason for such lavish display." His wife touched his arm in gentle reproof. "We must not indulge in speculation, my dear, particularly before our young companion." She turned to Clara with a kind smile. "Pay no attention to my husband, Miss Wynn. His medical practice makes him privy to too many confidences, I fear." Clara nodded politely, though her curiosity had been piqued by this exchange. As their carriage finally reached the entrance, she steeled herself for the evening ahead, an event she would attend as neither guest nor servant, but as guardian to a child whose welfare had somehow become the center of her existence. The Harringtons escorted her into the mansion's grand entrance hall, where guests presented their invitations to a major domo who announced each arrival with practiced aplomb. Clara's name, when it came, was presented simply as Miss Clara Wynn, companion to Lady Lydia Holdenmere, a designation that accurately reflected her position while sparing her the explicit label of governess. The ballroom of Tolland Park presented a scene of almost overwhelming splendor. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light over gilt furnishings and marble columns, while arrangements of autumn flowers and fruits created a harvest theme that managed to be both seasonal and opulent. The county's elite moved through this setting in a kaleidoscope of silk, satin, and jewels, their conversation creating a constant murmur beneath the orchestra's measured strains. Clara positioned herself near a column that offered both support and a degree of inconspicuousness, scanning the room for any sign of the Holdenmere party. They had not yet arrived, it seemed, though the frequent glances directed toward the entrance suggested she was not alone in awaiting their appearance. "Miss Wynn, is it not?" The voice at her elbow belonged to Lord Rowe, who had approached with the silent grace of a predator. "How delightful to find you here. I had not realized governesses were included among Mrs. Tolland's guests." The deliberate emphasis on her position and the implied impropriety of her presence was unmistakable. Clara straightened, meeting his gaze with calm dignity. "Good evening, Lord Rowe. I attend as Lady Lydia's companion at the Duke's request." "Of course," he replied, his smile never reaching his cold eyes. "The Duke is known for his unconventional household arrangements. I understand his mother has arrived from Scotland, a formidable woman, by all accounts." The conversation had barely begun, yet Clara already sensed dangerous currents beneath its seemingly innocuous surface. Recalling the Duke's explicit warning regarding Lord Rowe, she prepared to excuse herself when salvation arrived in the form of the majordomo's stentorian announcement. His Grace, the Duke of Holdenmere, the Dowager Duchess of Holdenmere, and Lady Lydia Holdenmere. A ripple of interest moved through the ballroom as the trio made their entrance. The Duke, commanding attention without apparent effort, the Dowager diminutive yet regal in lavender silk, and between them Lydia, her face a study in controlled apprehension as she surveyed the crowded room. Clara moved immediately toward them, conscious of Lord Rowe's gaze following her progress. Lydia's expression brightened upon seeing her governess, a small hand extending in greeting as Clara approached. "Miss Wynn, Grandmother says I may open my dance card now. Will you help me?" This simple request, delivered with childish eagerness, drew curious glances from nearby guests, particularly the young ladies who had clearly hoped for the Duke's attention. Clara took the small ivory card with its attached pencil, guiding Lydia toward a quieter corner where they might address the matter with less public scrutiny. As they consulted over the proper protocols for dance card management, Clara became aware of raised voices near the entrance. Mrs. Tolland's distinctive tones rising in what appeared to be an altercation with a new arrival. Glancing up, she saw their hostess engaged in heated conversation with a woman whose traveling attire suggested she had come directly from a journey. The Duke, who had been conversing with an elderly gentleman near the refreshment table, moved swiftly toward this disturbance. Clara watched as he addressed both women, his posture suggesting tension beneath his composed exterior. After a brief exchange, all three withdrew to an antechamber, leaving the ballroom buzzing with speculative whispers. The Dowager Duchess appeared at Clara's side, her expression betraying nothing of her thoughts regarding this development. "It appears my son has been called away on some matter of urgency," she observed. "Lydia, my dear, I believe the musicians are preparing for the first dance. Shall we find you a suitable partner?" As the Dowager guided Lydia toward a group of young people gathering for the opening quadrille, she paused to address Clara in a lowered voice. "Remain vigilant, Miss Wynn. The currents beneath tonight's festivities run deeper than they appear." With that cryptic admonition, she moved away, leaving Clara to wonder what drama was unfolding beyond the ballroom's glittering facade and what role she might yet be called upon to play in its resolution. The antechamber door remained firmly closed as the orchestra struck up the opening measures of the first dance. Clara observed Lydia's tentative steps through the quadrille, guided by a serious-faced boy of perhaps 12, whose mother had clearly instructed him in his gentlemanly duties. The Dowager Duchess watched from nearby, her regal bearing drawing deferential nods from passing guests, while her sharp eyes missed nothing of the room's shifting dynamics. Mrs. Tolland's absence from her own ball occasioned increasingly curious whispers among the assembly. Lady Millerton, a formidable matron whose 3 daughters hovered nearby like pastel butterflies, positioned herself strategically beside Clara. "Most irregular," she pronounced, her lorgnette trained on the antechamber door. "The Duke in private conference while the dancing commences, and our hostess nowhere to be seen. One might almost suspect a deliberate slight to the company." Clara, recognizing the fishing expedition for gossip, offered a neutral response. "I'm certain Mrs. Tolland would not absent herself without significant cause, Lady Millerton." The older woman's skepticism was palpable. "You are the governess, are you not? How curious that you should be included in tonight's festivities, and wearing the Holdenmere sapphires, unless my eyes deceive me." Clara's hand instinctively rose to the necklace, its weight suddenly more noticeable. The Duke kindly lent the piece for the evening, as a courtesy to Lady Lydia's companion. "A courtesy indeed," Lady Millerton murmured, her tone suggesting she found the explanation insufficient. "Those sapphires have not been seen in public since the Dowager's youth. Elizabeth never wore them, not even at her wedding breakfast." This information, delivered with evident relish, was clearly meant to unsettle. Before Clara could formulate a response, the antechamber door opened, revealing Mrs. Tolland, her complexion heightened by emotion and her movements unnaturally rigid as she rejoined her guests. The Duke followed a moment later, his expression revealing nothing of what had transpired, though Clara noted a new tension in the set of his shoulders. The mysterious third party, the woman in travelling clothes, was nowhere to be seen. Lady Millerton abandoned Clara without ceremony, gliding toward her hostess with the determined air of one seeking fresh intelligence. Left momentarily alone, Clara found herself approached by Sir Edmund, whose unexpected appearance suggested he had concluded his legal errand. "Miss Wynn," he greeted her, his customary composure somewhat disrupted. "I had not expected to join the festivities this evening, but circumstances have evolved. The Duke requests your presence in the library. Discreetly, if you please." The solicitor's carefully measured words conveyed urgency without alarm, a skill Clara had come to associate with his management of Haversley's affairs. "Of course, Lady Lydia is with the Dowager Duchess, and will remain so," Sir Edmund assured her. "The matter concerns a different subject entirely." With practiced inconspicuousness, he guided her from the ballroom through a side door and along a corridor lined with ancestral portraits, the Tolland lineage displayed in gilt frames that grew progressively more elaborate with each generation. The library, when they reached it, proved to be a masculine retreat of leather-bound volumes and hunting trophies, its heavy oak furnishings a stark contrast to the ballroom's gilt and crystal. The Duke stood before the hearth, engaged in low-voiced conversation with a woman Clara recognized as the traveler from the entrance hall. Closer inspection revealed a lady of perhaps 30, her attire suggesting modest means but impeccable taste, her carriage betraying education and breeding despite evident fatigue from her journey. "Miss Wynn," the Duke acknowledged, gesturing her forward. "Allow me to present Mrs. Caroline Blackwood, recently returned from India." "Caroline, this is Miss Clara Wynn, my niece's governess and—" He hesitated, as though seeking the appropriate designation. "A trusted member of my household." Mrs. Blackwood extended her hand with a weary smile. "Miss Wynn, I've heard much about you from Mrs. Tolland's correspondence with my aunt in Bombay, though I suspect the accuracy of her reports may be questionable, given what I know of the lady." This frank acknowledgement of Mrs. Tolland's unreliability, delivered with gentle humor rather than malice, immediately endeared the stranger to Clara. "You've travelled far, Mrs. Blackwood. Might I inquire what brings you to England at this particular time?" "A letter," the woman replied, glancing toward the Duke with an expression that held both apology and resolution. "A letter I believed destroyed, but which appears to have found its way into certain hands." Clara felt a sudden chill of recognition. "To the letter I returned to Haversley." "Precisely." The Duke's voice carried a note of grim satisfaction, as though a suspicion had been confirmed. Though not, it seems, before its contents were examined by parties with interests contrary to Haversley's welfare. Sir Edmund cleared his throat discreetly. "Perhaps we might illuminate Miss Wynn regarding the complete circumstances, Your Grace. Her position in this matter is somewhat precarious." The Duke nodded, gesturing for all present to be seated in the deep leather chairs that surrounded the hearth. "Mrs. Blackwood was my brother's closest confidant during his service in India," he began, his tone measured as though recounting facts long established. "After his death from fever, she undertook to settle certain affairs on behalf of my sister-in-law, who was by then also gravely ill. Affairs that included the guardianship of Lydia, Mrs. Blackwood continued, and the management of certain properties that would pass to her upon reaching her majority. Properties that, while modest by English standards, represent considerable wealth in Bombay. Clara began to perceive the outlines of a situation more complex than she had imagined, and the letter was written by my late wife, the Duke explained, to Mrs. Blackwood, seeking confirmation of arrangements made for Lydia's inheritance. Elizabeth had concerns regarding, he broke off, his expression darkening, regarding potential irregularities in the administration of my brother's estate. Sir Edmund took up the narrative thread with the precision of a man accustomed to navigating legal complexities. Lord Rowe served as the late Mr. Holdenmere's aide-de-camp and subsequently positioned himself as an advisor to the widow. His lordship's interest in the Bombay properties was, shall we say, more than professionally appropriate. He attempted to persuade Mrs. Holdenmere to sign over certain management rights, Mrs. Blackwood elaborated, her gentle voice hardening with evident distaste. When she refused, citing her daughter's future security, he became insistent. Caroline intervened, the Duke continued, the rare use of the lady's Christian name suggesting a familiarity born of shared concern rather than impropriety. She arranged passage for my sister-in-law and niece to England, but remained behind to secure documentation that would protect Lydia's interests. Documentation that was to accompany Elizabeth's response to my letter, Mrs. Blackwood concluded. A response I never received, as events overtook us all. The sequence of events now became clear to Clara. Elizabeth Holdenmere's untimely death, the letter lost amidst household disruption, and its eventual discovery in the village square. But one element remained unexplained. How did the letter come to be lost? And why would Lord Rowe have interest in it now, a year after the fact? Sir Edmund exchanged a glance with the Duke before responding. The Bombay properties have recently increased in value exponentially due to development of the harbour. What was a modest inheritance has become a considerable fortune, one that would naturally interest those with prior knowledge of its potential. Lord Rowe claims to possess documents signed by my brother that grant him partial ownership, the Duke added, his contempt for this assertion evident in his tone. Documents that, if authentic, would supersede Lydia's claim. But they cannot be authentic, Mrs. Blackwood insisted, leaning forward with sudden intensity. James Holdenmere would never have compromised his daughter's future in such a manner. He spoke often of his hopes for her education, her independence. The Duke's expression softened momentarily at this mention of his brother's paternal aspirations. Nevertheless, Rowe intends to present these alleged documents at the magistrate's court next week. Without contrary evidence, his claim may appear legitimate to those unfamiliar with my brother's character. Clara considered these revelations, understanding at last the undercurrents that had troubled Haversley since her arrival. And Mrs. Tolland's role in this affair is yet to be fully determined, Sir Edmund replied with diplomatic caution, though her evident distress upon Mrs. Blackwood's arrival suggests some awareness of Lord Rowe's activities. She has provided him social legitimacy, the Duke stated bluntly, and I suspect access to certain circles that might otherwise have been closed to a man of his questionable antecedents. Mrs. Blackwood sighed, fatigue evident in the slight slump of her shoulders. I've brought copies of the original trust documents from Bombay, but without the letter that Elizabeth wrote, the one that outlined her suspicions and requested my assistance, our position is weakened. The letter I found, Clara began hesitantly, was already opened when it came into my possession. If someone else read its contents before I discovered it, then they would know of Elizabeth's suspicions, the Duke concluded, and of Mrs. Blackwood's impending return with evidence that could thwart their plans. His expression hardened into resolve. We must assume Lord Rowe has this knowledge and will act accordingly. A knock at the library door interrupted their conference. The Dowager Duchess entered without awaiting response, her regal bearing undiminished despite evident concern. Alaric, your absence has been noted. Mrs. Tolland is preparing to announce supper, and Lydia grows anxious without familiar faces nearby. Her gaze fell upon Mrs. Blackwood, softening with immediate recognition. Caroline, my dear girl, when did you arrive from Bombay? You look positively exhausted. This warm greeting suggested a deeper connection than had been explained, though Clara had little opportunity to consider its implications as Sir Edmund rose to his feet. We must return to the ballroom without delay, Your Grace. Any prolonged absence will fuel precisely the speculation we wish to avoid. The Duke nodded, his gaze meeting Clara's with unexpected directness. Miss Wynn, I must ask your continued discretion in this matter. For Lydia's sake. Of course, Your Grace. The simplicity of her response belied the complexity of her feelings. Concern for her young charge's welfare intermingled with growing indignation that anyone would seek to profit at the expense of a motherless child. As they moved to rejoin the festivities, Mrs. Blackwood touched Clara's arm lightly. "The Duke speaks highly of your care for Lydia," she murmured. "I'm glad she has found such a guardian in these difficult times." The woman's sincere appreciation momentarily disarmed Clara, who had grown accustomed to viewing her position at Haversley as temporary, a professional engagement rather than an emotional investment. Yet she could no longer deny that Lydia had claimed a portion of her heart, nor that the Duke's welfare had somehow become entangled with her own sense of rightness in the world. The ballroom, when they re-entered it, presented a scene of animated conviviality that seemed disconnected from the grave concerns they had just discussed. The orchestra played a lively country dance, couples weaving through complex figures with evident enjoyment, while laughter and conversation created a constant backdrop of civilized pleasure. Lydia rushed to Clara's side immediately, her expression brightening from anxious uncertainty to relief. "Miss Wynn, Uncle said you had gone to fetch your shawl, but you were absent for ages. Mrs. Tolland is about to announce supper, and I'm to go in with Grandmother." "I'm here now," Clara assured her, smoothing a stray curl from the child's forehead with the automatic tenderness that had developed between them, and looking forward to hearing all about your dancing. Did young Master Harrington prove a worthy partner? As Lydia launched into an enthusiastic account of her ballroom experiences, Clara caught sight of Lord Rowe across the room, his gaze fixed upon the Duke with an intensity that sent a chill through her veins. The man's ambition was palpable even at a distance, a cold, calculating hunger that viewed a child's inheritance as merely an obstacle to be overcome. The evening had begun as a social exercise, a cautious emergence from mourning into public life. It had transformed in the space of a single hour into something far more consequential, a battlefield where the stakes were a young girl's future, and the weapons were documents, testimony, and influence. Clara straightened her shoulders, the weight of the sapphire necklace a reminder of the trust placed in her by the Holdenmere family. Whatever role she might be called upon to play in the coming confrontation, she would not be found wanting. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of carefully maintained social pleasantries, each interaction now colored by Clara's awareness of the currents flowing beneath the glittering surface. She observed Mrs. Tolland's heightened animation with new understanding, not merely a hostess's pride in her successful ball, but the desperate gaiety of a woman whose schemes teetered on the edge of exposure. Lord Rowe maintained a strategic distance from the Duke throughout supper, concentrating his attention on a circle of county gentlemen whose investments in overseas ventures might prove useful to his ambitions. Occasionally his gaze would drift toward Lydia, a speculative assessment that hardened Clara's resolve to shield her charge from whatever machinations he might devise. "You appear troubled, Miss Wynn." The Dowager Duchess's voice drew Clara from these dark reflections as they stood watching Lydia's careful navigation of the dessert course. "I trust my son has explained the situation adequately." "Yes, Your Grace," Clara confirmed, surprised by the Dowager's direct approach to such a delicate matter in so public a setting. "Though I confess I find it difficult to maintain composure when confronted with those who would harm Lady Lydia's interests." A glimmer of approval appeared in the older woman's shrewd eyes. "A natural response, but one we must master. Battle anger has its place, but rarely at a harvest ball." She gestured subtly toward the Duke, who was engaged in apparently cordial conversation with Sir William Pendleton, the county magistrate. "Alaric understands the art of strategic patience. He moves pieces into position long before his opponents recognize the game has begun." This description of the Duke's methodical approach to conflict illuminated aspects of his character that Clara had glimpsed but not fully appreciated, the careful reserve that concealed not emotional coldness, as she had initially suspected, but a formidable tactical intelligence. Mrs. Blackwood's arrival was unexpected, Clara ventured, curious about the Dowager's evident familiarity with the lady. By some, perhaps. The faintest smile touched the Dowager's lips. "Caroline has been corresponding with me since James's death. A remarkable woman, educated at a time when female intellect was considered an inconvenience, and courageous enough to stand against those who would exploit a child's vulnerability." The orchestra began the opening strains of a waltz, drawing couples to the dance floor in a swirl of silks and satins. Clara noted Mrs. Tolland's determined advance toward the Duke, her lavender gown cutting through the crowd like a ship's prow through calm seas. "The final assault," the Dowager observed dryly. "Tradition dictates that he cannot refuse our hostess a dance without causing comment. Watch how he manages it, Miss Wynn. It will be a masterclass in polite deflection." Indeed, the Duke executed a bow of perfect correctness as Mrs. Tolland approached, his expression betraying nothing of his true feelings regarding the lady. They exchanged words Clara could not hear, followed by what appeared to be the Duke's apologetic indication of his still formal mourning attire. Mrs. Tolland's smile tightened momentarily before she made a gracious gesture of understanding, accepting instead the arm of Sir William, who led her onto the floor with evident satisfaction. "Well played," the Dowager murmured. "He has maintained propriety while avoiding the intimacy of a waltz. Beatrice will find no grounds for complaint, though her disappointment is palpable." As the evening progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, Clara found herself increasingly aware of the symbolic weight of the sapphire necklace against her throat. The jewels represented not merely monetary value, but a heritage, a lineage, a continuity that Lord Rose sought to disrupt for personal gain. The thought strengthened her determination to assist in preserving Lydia's birthright, though she remained uncertain what practical contribution she might make to this cause. The Duke approached as the orchestra prepared for the final set, his formal demeanor softened by what appeared to be genuine concern. "Miss Wynn, you look fatigued. Perhaps you would prefer to return to Haversley ahead of our party. The Harringtons are departing shortly and would be pleased to offer you conveyance." Clara recognized the suggestion as more than mere solicitude for her comfort. "Is there some service I might perform at Haversley, Your Grace? Some preparation for Mrs. Blackwood's arrival, perhaps?" A flicker of approval crossed his features at her swift comprehension. "Indeed, Sir Edmund will accompany you with certain documents that require secure storage until morning. Mrs. Wilson should be informed of our guest's imminent arrival, and rooms prepared accordingly." "Of course, Your Grace. I shall see to it immediately," Clara curtsied, understanding that her role in the evening's strategy extended beyond social appearance. "Shall I bid Lady Lydia good night, or will you be departing soon as well?" "We shall follow within the hour," he assured her, his gaze shifting briefly to where Lydia sat beside the Dowager, their heads bent together in conversation that appeared to involve the comparative merits of various sweetmeats. "My mother wishes to make her proper farewells to certain acquaintances she has not seen since Elizabeth's funeral." Clara took her leave of Lydia, with promises of tomorrow's reunion, the child's drowsy contentment suggesting that her first formal ball had provided sufficient excitement for one evening. Sir Edmund materialized at Clara's side as she collected her shawl from the cloakroom, a leather portfolio tucked discreetly beneath his arm. "The Harringtons await us," he murmured, guiding her toward the entrance where the doctor and his wife stood ready to depart. "Lord Rowe watches from the card room. It would be prudent to avoid attracting his attention." They achieved their escape without incident, the night air refreshingly cool after the ballroom's perfumed warmth. As their carriage departed Tolland Park, Clara caught a glimpse of illuminated windows reflected in the ornamental lake, a scene of perfect autumnal splendor that belied the human complexities unfolding within its elegant confines. The journey passed in companionable silence, the Harringtons discreetly refraining from questions regarding their early departure or Sir Edmund's presence. Only as they approached Haversley's gates did the solicitor speak, his voice low enough to reach only Clara's ears. "The documents in this portfolio represent our best hope of countering Lord Rowe's claims," he explained, his usually placid features taut with concern. "Original correspondence between the late Mr. Holdenmere and the Bombay authorities, establishing trusts that cannot be breached without multiple signatures that include the Duke's own. And Lord Rowe claims to have documents that supersede these arrangements." "So he asserts," Sir Edmund confirmed, his skepticism evident. "Documents supposedly signed shortly before James Holdenmere's death, a death that came suddenly, leaving no opportunity for such significant legal alterations." Clara considered this information as Haversley's imposing silhouette emerged from the darkness, its windows illuminated in anticipation of the family's return. "You suspect forgery, then?" "I suspect many things, Miss Wynn," Sir Edmund replied carefully, "but suspicion without proof serves little purpose in a magistrate's court. We require evidence, conclusive evidence, of Lord Rowe's duplicity." The carriage halted before the main entrance, where footmen stood ready despite the late hour. Clara bade the Harringtons good night with sincere thanks for their kindness, then accompanied Sir Edmund into the house. Mrs. Wilson awaited them in the entrance hall, her usual composure slightly disrupted by the evening's unexpected developments. "I've prepared the blue guest chamber for Mrs. Blackwood," she informed them, accepting Clara's cloak with practiced efficiency. His Grace sent word by messenger that the lady would require accommodations. "Is there anything particular she might need after her journey? A light supper would be appreciated, I imagine," Clara suggested, recalling Mrs. Blackwood's evident fatigue. "And perhaps hot water for washing. The journey from Southampton is arduous in the best circumstances." Mrs. Wilson nodded, pleased by these practical considerations. "I'll see to it directly. Will Sir Edmund require refreshment as well?" "Thank you, no," the solicitor demurred, gesturing toward the portfolio he carried. "I must secure these documents in His Grace's study before attending to other matters. Miss Wynn, perhaps you would accompany me. There is a matter concerning Lady Lydia's lessons that I wish to discuss." This transparent pretext for continued conference passed without comment from Mrs. Wilson, who merely nodded and departed to oversee the preparations for their expected guests. Clara followed Sir Edmund to the Duke's study, where he immediately moved to a particular bookcase and pressed a hidden mechanism that caused a section of shelving to swing outward, revealing a concealed safe. "Few know of this repository," Sir Edmund explained as he manipulated the lock with practiced hands. "The Duke's grandfather had it installed during the Napoleonic Wars, when certain family papers required protection from potential French sympathizers." The safe door opened silently, revealing an interior lined with green baize and containing several document boxes and what appeared to be jewelry cases. Sir Edmund placed the portfolio inside with evident relief, securing the door once more before returning the bookcase to its original position. "Now," he said, turning to Clara with unexpected gravity, "there is another matter that requires your attention, one the Duke hesitated to mention at Tolland Park for fear of being overheard." Clara felt a flutter of apprehension at his serious tone. "Is it concerning Lady Lydia?" "Indirectly, yes." Sir Edmund moved to the Duke's desk, unlocking a drawer from which he retrieved a small leather-bound volume. "This is Elizabeth Holdenmere's personal diary, kept during the months before her death. She recorded her suspicions regarding Lord Rowe and her correspondence with Mrs. Blackwood." He extended the journal toward Clara, who accepted it with hesitant hands. "Why show this to me, Sir Edmund? Surely the Duke's late wife's private thoughts are not my concern." "They become your concern," he replied gravely, "when they include the location of evidence that could prove decisive in protecting Lady Lydia's inheritance. The Duke believes, and I concur, that Elizabeth may have secreted copies of her correspondence in a location known only to her." Understanding dawned slowly. "And you believe I might discover this location where others have failed? You have something the Duke and I lack, Miss Wynn, a woman's perspective on a woman's mind. Elizabeth was methodical in her household management, but also deeply sentimental about certain matters. The Duke has searched her personal chambers extensively without result." Clara glanced down at the journal, its worn leather binding suggesting frequent handling. "Does the diary not specify the location directly? It contains references to the usual place and where blossoms fall in spring, poetic allusions that have defied our practical interpretations." Sir Edmund's expression betrayed rare frustration. "The Duke is reluctant to expose you to this intrigue, but circumstances grow urgent. Lord Rowe intends to present his alleged evidence at the quarter sessions next Tuesday. Without compelling contrary documentation, the magistrate may have no choice but to recognize his claim." The weight of this responsibility settled upon Clara's shoulders, heavier than the sapphires she still wore. "I shall do everything in my power to assist, Sir Edmund, for Lady Lydia's sake." "For Lydia," he agreed, his features softening momentarily, "and perhaps for others at Haversley who have already suffered greater losses than financial ones." This oblique reference to the Duke's emotional state following Elizabeth's death lingered in Clara's mind as she prepared for bed that night, the diary resting on her bedside table like a silent sentinel. She had removed the sapphire necklace, returning it to its morocco case with reverent care, yet somehow its weight seemed to remain, a tangible reminder of her evolving connection to the Holdenmere family. As she extinguished her lamp, the distant sound of carriage wheels announced the Duke's return from Tolland Park. Soon Haversley would settle into its nightly stillness, its occupants seeking rest after an evening of unexpected revelations and shifting alliances. Yet for Clara, sleep proved elusive, her thoughts circling like autumn leaves in a persistent breeze. Lord Rowe's calculating gaze, Mrs. Blackwood's weary determination, the Dowager's shrewd assessment of strategic possibilities. And underlying all these considerations, a question she dared not examine too closely. When the crisis had passed and Lydia's inheritance was secured, what place would remain for a governess whose duties had expanded far beyond the boundaries of her original engagement? The answer remained as elusive as Elizabeth Haldenmere's hidden correspondence, and considerably more unsettling to contemplate in the darkened silence of the Blue Room. Spring arrived at Haversley with determined brightness, coaxing blossoms from dormant branches and drawing vibrant carpets of wildflowers across the once barren parkland. The formal gardens, neglected during the long months of mourning, had been restored to their former glory under the combined supervision of the Dowager Duchess and Mrs. Blackwood, whose decision to remain in England had brought unexpected vitality to the household. Clara stood by the morning-room window, observing Lydia's progress through the walled garden with Mrs. Blackwood at her side. The child, no longer quite so much a child, moved with growing confidence, pausing occasionally to consult a leather-bound notebook in which she recorded botanical observations with scientific precision. Her golden hair, caught by the breeze, shimmered in the April sunshine like a promise fulfilled. "She grows more like her mother every day," the Duke's voice remarked from the doorway, causing Clara to turn in mild surprise, though James would be pleased to see his scientific inclinations have found expression as well. "Lady Lydia has made remarkable progress these past months," Clara acknowledged, her gaze returning to the garden where her charge now knelt beside a bed of early roses, carefully recording their development. "Mrs. Blackwood's influence has been most beneficial, as has yours, Miss Wynn." The Duke entered fully into the room, his movements carrying the same measured grace that Clara had noted from their first encounter, though the rigid formality of grief had softened into something more human. "Your discovery of Elizabeth's correspondence proved decisive, as you know." Clara's cheeks warmed at the reminder of that January morning when, after weeks of fruitless searching, she had chanced upon the hidden compartment in the base of Elizabeth's favorite plant stand, the very aloe vera that Lydia had named the Duke of Wellington. The cache of documents contained therein had indeed proven decisive when presented at the quarter sessions, revealing not only Lord Rowe's duplicity, but also his systematic embezzlement from the Haldenmere estate in India. "Providence guided my hand, Your Grace," she demurred, though in truth it had been Lydia's casual remark about her aunt's habit of hiding treasures that had led Clara to the critical discovery. "I merely followed the threads that others had laid." "You undersell your contribution," the Duke countered, moving to stand beside her at the window, "as you have consistently undersold your value to this household since your arrival." This frank assessment, delivered without preamble, caught Clara off guard. In the months since Lord Rowe's disgrace and subsequent flight to the continent, life at Haversley had settled into a comfortable rhythm that she had come to treasure. Lydia's education progressed admirably. The Dowager Duchess had established a suite of rooms for her extended visits, and Mrs. Blackwood had assumed responsibility for corresponding with the trustees in Bombay regarding the management of the child's inheritance. Clara's position, however, remained unchanged, governess to a child who increasingly required specialized instruction beyond her capabilities. The mathematics tutor from Cambridge, the drawing master from London, the dancing instructor from Bath, all represented the inevitable evolution of Lydia's education toward accomplishments befitting her station and fortune. "I have endeavored to fulfill my duties to the best of my ability, Your Grace," Clara replied, her tone carefully neutral despite the sudden constriction in her throat. "Lady Lydia's progress is reward enough." The Duke turned from the window to face her directly, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "I have received a letter from your father, Miss Wynn." This unexpected statement momentarily robbed Clara of speech. She had maintained regular correspondence with Reverend Wynn throughout her tenure at Haversley, though she had not mentioned her father to the Duke in many weeks. "My father has written to you, Your Grace. May I ask regarding what matter?" "Regarding an offer he has received from the Bishop of Exeter, a parish in Devon with a larger congregation and greater responsibilities." The Duke's gaze remained steady upon her face, as though seeking some specific reaction. "He writes that he has consulted you on the matter and received your blessing to accept the position." "Indeed, I encouraged him to do so," Clara confirmed, recalling the lengthy letter in which she had assured her father that her situation at Haversley was secure enough that he need not concern himself with her future arrangements. "The Devon climate will be beneficial for his rheumatism, and the intellectual companionship of a cathedral town will provide stimulation his current position lacks." Most daughters would consider their own situation when advising a father on relocation, the Duke observed mildly, "yet you appear to have given no thought to how his departure might affect your own circumstances should your position at Haversley conclude." The implication was clear and painful. Clara squared her shoulders, determined to meet this oblique dismissal with dignity. "I have always understood my engagement here to be contingent upon Lady Lydia's needs. As she advances toward young womanhood, those needs naturally evolve beyond what I can provide." An accurate assessment of Lydia's educational requirements, the Duke acknowledged, but entirely beside the point. Before Clara could question this cryptic response, he continued with careful deliberation. "Miss Wynn, Clara, I did not summon you to discuss the termination of your employment, but rather to propose its transformation." The unexpected use of her Christian name, coupled with the ambiguity of his statement, rendered Clara momentarily speechless. The Duke took advantage of her silence to move toward the fireplace, retrieving a small Morocco case from the mantelpiece, the same case, she realized with surprise, that had contained the sapphire necklace she had worn to the harvest ball. "The past year has brought changes to Haversley that I could not have anticipated," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who had rehearsed his words with care. "When you first arrived with Elizabeth's letter, I was, as you observed with unsettling accuracy, a man petrified by grief, moving through existence with hollow precision." Clara recalled that first encounter, the tall figure silhouetted against the dim light of the entrance hall, his grief a palpable force that seemed to bend the very air around him. "Your Grace, there is no need, there is every need," he interrupted gently, "for plain speaking between us now. You brought more than a letter to Haversley that day, Clara. You brought presence, human presence, into a house that had forgotten how to breathe." He opened the case, revealing not the sapphire necklace she had expected, but a ring of deceptively simple design. A band of intricately wrought silver surrounding a midnight blue stone that caught the spring light from the windows. "This belonged to my grandmother," he explained, his gaze holding hers with unwavering intensity. "The Dowager suggested it might suit the purpose I now propose." Clara's heart seemed to suspend its rhythm as comprehension dawned. "Your Grace, Alaric, I am a governess, the daughter of a country vicar. Society would never countenance—" "Society," he interrupted with surprising vehemence, "has no voice in this matter. I have consulted those whose opinions hold actual weight. My mother, who admires your fortitude, Sir Edmund, who respects your integrity, Mrs. Blackwood, who values your kindness, and most importantly Lydia, who loves you as she has loved no one since her parents' passing." He extended the ring case toward her, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever witnessed. "I do not offer this in haste or without consideration, Clara. The months since Elizabeth's death have taught me that grief, while necessary, is not life's final chapter. You have reminded me, through your care for Lydia, your defense of her interests, your quiet courage in the face of adversity, that the heart, once closed, can learn to open again." Clara gazed at the ring, its sapphire gleaming with subtle fire, then raised her eyes to meet his. "And your own heart, Alaric, does it truly seek this transformation, or merely a solution to practical concerns?" "My heart," he replied with unexpected gentleness, "has been following you since you knelt beside a broken flower pot and promised a weeping child that all was not lost. I simply required time to recognize its destination." Outside in the garden, Lydia's laughter floated upward, bright, clear, unburdened by the shadows that had once haunted her young face. Mrs. Blackwood's voice joined hers, the two engaged in some botanical discovery that prompted shared delight. Clara moved toward the window once more, drawing Alaric to her side with a gesture. "Look there, at what has grown from broken earth. That is what you have built, what we have nurtured together. Not merely Lydia's happiness," he murmured, understanding her meaning immediately, "but a family forged through choice rather than circumstance." "A family," Clara agreed, turning to face him fully. "One I have come to cherish beyond all expectation or propriety." She extended her hand, a gesture simultaneously simple and profound. "If you are certain, Alaric, if this is truly the transformation you seek, then I accept with a glad heart." The ring slipped onto her finger, as though crafted specifically for this moment, this union. Its weight felt different from the necklace she had once borrowed, not a burden of temporary responsibility, but a permanent connection to something living and genuine. "The banns will be read next Sunday," Alaric said, his voice steady though his eyes betrayed deeper emotion. "My mother suggests a June wedding, when the roses in the East Garden are at their finest." "June," Clara echoed, the word carrying the promise of summer warmth after the long winter of mourning that had preceded her arrival at Haversley. That seems fitting. Later that afternoon, as the spring sun began its descent toward the horizon, Clara found herself in the conservatory, standing before the aloe plant whose broken pot had marked her first true connection with Lydia. The Duke of Wellington, as the child still insisted on calling it, had not merely survived its mishap but flourished, producing 2 healthy offshoots that now grew alongside the parent plant. "I thought I might find you here," the Dowager Duchess remarked as she entered, her observant gaze immediately noting the ring on Clara's finger. "Ah, he has finally gathered his courage. I was beginning to wonder if I might need to intervene more directly." Clara smiled at this frank admission of matchmaking intentions. "Your son is a deliberate man, Your Grace. He does nothing without careful consideration." "True enough," the Dowager conceded with a slight smile, though in this instance, his heart recognized its course long before his mind permitted acknowledgement. Elizabeth would have approved, you know. She valued authenticity above all other qualities. This mention of the first Duchess of Haldenmere, offered without artifice or uncomfortable comparison, touched Clara deeply. "I hope to honor her memory through my care for those she loved." "You have already done so," the Dowager assured her, gently adjusting a tendril of jasmine that had escaped its trellis. "Now you must build your own legacy at Haversley, one that acknowledges the past while embracing a future of your own design." As twilight settled over the estate, Clara walked alone to the small knoll where Elizabeth Haldenmere's memorial stood. Not a grave, for she rested in the family plot beside the parish church, but a simple stone bench positioned to catch both morning and evening light. She had never visited this spot before, feeling it somehow presumptuous to intrude upon this most private aspect of the family's grief. Now, however, she approached with reverent steps, seating herself on the cool marble as the first stars appeared in the deepening azure of the evening sky. "I have not come to seek permission," she said softly to the empty air, "for I believe Alaric knows his own mind. But I would have you know that I will cherish what you built here, the love you cultivated, the beauty you created, the child you embraced as your own. These things will endure, though in new forms and with different hands to tend them." A gentle breeze stirred the new leaves on nearby branches, carrying with it the scent of spring blossoms and rich earth. Clara closed her eyes, feeling not the ghost of a predecessor, but the living presence of a house restored to joy, a child reclaiming her birthright of happiness, a man learning to live fully in the present while honoring rather than entombing the past. When she opened them again, Alaric stood at the path's entrance, Lydia's small hand clasped in his. They had come looking for her, these two who had somehow become the center of her world, not through grand passion or dramatic circumstance, but through the quiet miracle of daily care, shared purpose, and the healing that comes when broken hearts find companions on the journey toward wholeness. "Come," Alaric said simply, extending his free hand toward her. "The evening grows cool and Haversley awaits." Clara rose from the bench, her fingers intertwining with his as Lydia skipped ahead down the path, eager to share some new discovery with Mrs. Blackwood or the Dowager. Behind them, the memorial stood in peaceful solitude, its marble warmed by the day's sunshine, its purpose fulfilled, not as a shrine to grief, but as a waypoint on the journey from loss to renewal. Together they walked toward the house that had once been a monument to mourning, but now stood illuminated against the evening sky, windows bright with lamplight, doors open to the spring air, the sound of conversation and occasional laughter drifting outward to greet them. Haversley had found its voice again, and in that harmonious chorus, Clara recognized the most profound truth of her journey, that love, when pure, does not require grand gestures or passionate declarations. It manifests in presence, in steadfastness, in the courage to return a lost letter to a grieving duke, and in so doing, to return something far more precious: the capacity to begin again. In the still chambers of grief, we often board up our hearts against the possibility of further pain, believing that solitude offers sanctuary. Yet as the Duke of Haldenmere discovered, such isolation merely preserves our wounds rather than healing them. True healing begins not with dramatic gestures, but with simple presence, the courage to appear at another's door with nothing more than honest intention. Clara's act of returning a letter became an unwitting invitation to return to life itself. Perhaps this is love's deepest wisdom, that we find renewal not by seeking it directly, but by offering it first to others. In the act of helping a child replant her broken aloe, in the careful nurturing of another's hope, we inadvertently cultivate the soil of our own rebirth. The most profound transformations occur quietly. A door that opens, a hand that reaches out, a heart that decides against all evidence of past pain to trust once more in possibility. These are the true miracles available to us all if we have the courage to recognize them. So let us remember Haversley's lesson, that from the broken soil of loss, new life inevitably emerges for those patient enough to tend it, and that love, in its purest form, is not a passionate flame that consumes, but a steady light that illuminates the path back to ourselves and to each other. Did this story touch your heart? Subscribe to receive more tales of healing, redemption, and the quiet courage it takes to begin again after loss. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What moment in Clara and the Duke's journey resonated most deeply with you? Your voice matters in this community of storytellers and story lovers.